Hello, everyone. Again, just a few things to go over with this free response question. These were pretty straightforward, but sometimes they get a little confusing. So I just wanted to do this video so you could check your work and then see if you had a question about something. Maybe an explanation could be helpful in addition to the answer key. So use this video that way. The quiz or the assessment that you have on Tuesday will be very similar to this in that it is shaped like an FRQ. Free response questions largely have several different parts to them, and usually they're worth about 10 or 15 points, and they include partial credit. What's nice about a free response question is every single part is usually assessed separately, so you can end up with like a 9 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10. Usually the questions get harder as you move along the free response question. The first parts of the free response question may ask you to look at a basic graph or to draw a graph. So the beginning questions are really setting up some of the answer to the problem. And then there's a few questions at the end that are usually more challenging. So it will have a very similar, kind of look tomorrow. You'll have two free response questions. And just like on the AP exam, you'll have the ability to have some time to do the question. So you should have plenty of time in class tomorrow. And you also will notice that you will have to hand graph, do label really well, and be clear in your graphs, okay? So let's look at this first one. Draw and label a supply and demand graph for surfboards below. Identify equilibrium, price, and quantity. So the first thing that we're going to do is draw, our demand curve, which is downward sloping. I've labeled it D1. And then you also can have your supply curve, which is upward sloping, label that S1. And as a result, we would have equilibrium price of P1 and equilibrium quantity of Q1. Now we learn that the world's largest producer of surfboard foam stopped production. Surfboard foam would be an input for surfboards. So, we're interested in what happens in the market for surfboards, and the product that goes into the making of surfboards is now in a much lower quantity, which tells us that the price is going to be much higher for that particular surfboard foam. It's going to be hard to get, and it's going to be very expensive. So what will we expect to happen to our production of surfboards? It's going to decrease, right? It's going to shift left. As a result of our shift left, we're going to see a price increase and a quantity supplied that decreases, right? So we can look right here at P2 and Q2. That would be, what happens as a result of the supply shift left, S2. At the same time, so now assume surfing becomes widely popular, demonstrate on the graph the effect of this change. So we're going to assume that they mean the same graph. And so now we basically have a double shift. We had a leftward shift in supply because consumer taste for surfboards is, exploding. We're going to also see an increase in demand. And I know that for part A, I've noted supply shifting left. I labeled it on the graph with the arrow. I also noted it in part A, supply shifts left. This is a decrease in supply. And then I also put for part B, demand shifts right. It's an increase in demand, and the arrow indicates that. And then for part C, what happens compared to the original equilibrium and price, which is at, Q1, what do we see when we look at the second equilibrium quantity and price, okay, after the demand increase and the supply decrease? And I don't really have the quantity labeled well on the x-axis, but we see, well, that's because the quantity is indeterminate, right? The quantity is decreasing with the leftward shift of supply, but it's increasing with the rightward shift of demand. So because we don't know which is greater, quantity is indeterminate. In the case of price, both the increase in demand and the decrease in supply lead to an increase in price. So it's definitive, right? Price is going to increase. So price increases, quantity is indeterminate, or quantity is question mark, if that's what you want to put. Next question. Early in the 20th century, the advent of the tractor revolutionized the production of wheat. And this is a real historical example, right? We see a lot of farmers get into a great deal of trouble, largely because productivity is so increased, there's an overproduction of goods, as a result of mechanization. But in any case, let's show this effect. I'm looking at the lower left for my graph. Using supply and demand model, what is the effect of this new production technique? See graph A, the quantity will increase and price will decrease. We can certainly see that because of the increase in the advent of the tractor, this productivity enhancement, a rightward shift in supply as a result, an increase in the quantity and a decrease in the price. Okay, so that makes sense. Now that we understand that that's happened, to stabilize prices, the government is going to put a price floor on wheat. In other words, they're going to raise prices for farmers, so wheat farmers don't go belly up. On a new graph, show graphically the price floor and identify what happens to quantity demanded, quantity supplied, and consumer surplus. Okay, well, before we had an equilibrium price and quantity. So the market was in equilibrium. Here comes the price floor, which is by definition greater than the equilibrium. You could label this, PF if you want, or something like that. But now we have the price floor. Because we have the price floor, our quantity supplied is greater than our quantity demanded. We're no longer at equilibrium. The quantity that's actually going to get produced in this market will be the quantity that is demanded. But quantity demanded can be found on the demand curve. What is the quantity demanded at this specific price? Remember the law of demand, at a given price. What is the quantity demanded? That's the relationship. And in this case, we can see QD is quantity demanded. Quantity supplied, however, is not the same as quantity demanded. Quantity supplied at this price of PF, the price floor, is going to be much greater. Okay, quantity supplied is going to increase, quantity demanded is going to decrease. What's happened to consumer surplus as a result of this price floor? Consumer surplus has decreased. Before, at the lower price, it used to be this entire triangle here. This was all consumer surplus. Now, because of the higher price, there are consumers that are going to A, pay a higher price, but also B, fewer consumers in the market are going to be served, right? Or, there's less consumer products being sold in this market. Our consumer surplus after the price increase will be this smaller triangle right here. We're looking at all of those transactions on the demand curve that get a good deal, and this is the price. The higher the price goes up, the less and less and less there's consumer surplus, okay? If we go to the rest of this question, let's see, identify if the price, okay, so that one, consumer surplus. Years later, the government abolished the effective price floor, causing the price of wheat to return to equilibrium. Okay, so imagine now we're just back at our regular graph. Identify if the price increased or decreased after the law was abolished. Okay, well, we know that the law, if the equilibrium price is what's going to be the price will decrease, right? Because there is now, a lower price. Before, the price was up here. The equilibrium price, if this price floor is not mandated, it's not binding, the market will self-correct to the equilibrium price of P. And then identify how abolishing the law affected quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Well, now we would have an equal quantity supplied and quantity demanded. We'd be allocatively efficient, okay? If we look at the last question, assume that the market for home security systems is perfectly competitive. Don't worry about that for now. We will look at different types of market structures. For now, everything we've looked at is perfectly competitive. Upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, lots and lots of competition. It's a typical model for a theoretical market. And we also are saying it's in equilibrium. Using a correctly labeled graph of supply and demand, show each of the following. So we're looking to do the equilibrium price and quantity labeled P and Q. So if we look at graph A, here's our downward sloping demand, our upward sloping supply, P equilibrium price, Q equilibrium quantity, allocatively efficient market. Okay, no problem at all. If we had to label consumer surplus and producer surplus, you can see that here. This is a market where there's no deadweight loss, so we have maximized consumer surplus, maximized producer surplus. If we were totaling them together, we would just call it total surplus, okay? Now we're being asked, suppose that the government imposes an effective or binding price ceiling. So before we had a price floor above the equilibrium, now a price ceiling below the equilibrium. Redraw your graph in part A and label the price ceiling as P2. Completely shade the area representing the sum of consumer and producer surplus after the imposition of the price ceiling. So here we can look at the price ceiling. Okay, so you can see the price ceiling right here. What happens as a result of this? Okay, so if we go, okay, completely shade the areas of consumer and producer surplus. Well, once we lower the price to P2, a few things happen. One is that now the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So at the price of P2, we're not allocatively efficient. We will have a deadweight loss. We also have a quantity demanded that's greater than quantity supplied. So it's not going to be an ideal situation, at least economists would say so. We can see that some consumers are benefiting from the lower price. So before the price was way up here, some consumers who are getting the good actually are paying a lower price, but fewer consumers are getting the good. We actually can't even measure whether this price ceiling is good or bad for consumers, depending on what the numbers actually tell us. If the consumer surplus is really so much better, that might mean because the price is so much lower. If it's not really that much better, we might say because the number of consumers served might be less. But in any case, you can see the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and you have the effective price ceiling. Suppose the demand for home security systems decreases. So now what happens if your home home security system decreases and price stays the same and producer surplus, the supply curve rather, stays the same? What will happen to your consumer surplus? Well, your consumer surplus is going to shrink because you still have a price ceiling. So the bottom part of your price ceiling will be price P2, but this demand curve would be, say, like right here, the demand curve that also informs your consumer surplus would be a lot lower, and you will have a decrease in consumer surplus. What happens to producer surplus? There's going to be no change because there's no change to price and there's no change to your supply curve. Okay, only the demand curve is changing and moving around. That is not going to affect producer surplus at all. I hope that this was helpful to you. I will see you tomorrow.